A voice unheard. The morning sun broke through the curtains in Ethan Miller's modest room, casting golden streaks across the cluttered desk where a half-finished model airplane sat. Ethan stirred awake, his thoughts immediately returning to the scene he had witnessed a week ago at the park. It had etched itself into his mind, a vivid memory that wouldn't let go. The image of the man dragging a blonde woman into the car, her face a mix of terror and defiance, haunted him. It wasn't just an argument. Ethan was sure of that. And now, after seeing Lucas Hart's face on the news, accused of murdering a woman who wasn't blonde but a brunette, he knew something was terribly wrong. Ethan was an ordinary 10-year-old boy in many ways. He loved riding his bike, playing video games, and annoying his older sister. But his knack for noticing details others overlooked often set him apart. His teachers called him observant, while his mom just said he was too curious for his own good. This time, though, Ethan knew his curiosity wasn't a trivial matter. It was the key to saving someone's life. At breakfast, his mom, Jessica, busied herself packing her bag for jury duty. Ethan saw his chance. "Mom," he began, his voice tentative, "can I come to the courthouse with you today?" Jessica froze, her eyebrows furrowing as she turned to him. "The courthouse? Ethan, it's not exactly a place for kids." "I won't bother anyone, I promise," he said quickly. I want to see what it's like." Jessica studied her son for a moment. She saw the determination in his wide blue eyes. Sighing, she finally relented. "Fine, but you stay put, okay? No wandering around." Ethan nodded, hiding a smile. He had no intention of staying put. The courthouse was larger and more imposing than Ethan had imagined. Its marble floors gleamed under the fluorescent lights, and the distant hum of voices echoed through the grand halls. Jessica handed Ethan a book and granola bar before disappearing into the jury assembly room. As soon as she was out of sight, Ethan took a deep breath and headed for the courtroom where Lucas Hart's trial was underway. The room was packed. Reporters scribbled furiously in their notepads, cameras clicked, and spectators whispered behind cupped hands. Ethan slipped into a seat at the back, unnoticed amid the commotion. The prosecutor was making his case, laying out evidence that seemed damning. Lucas had been seen arguing with Alyssa Green the night she disappeared. His fingerprints were on her belongings, and he had no alibi. Ethan clenched his fists. He wanted to scream, to tell everyone they were wrong, but fear held him back. What if they didn't believe him? What if he made things worse? Then the defense attorney called Lucas to the stand, and Ethan's hesitation vanished. Lucas took his seat, his eyes sunken and his shoulders slumped. Ethan's breath caught. It was the man from the park, the man he had seen that day. But something was different. This man wasn't angry. He was defeated, broken. The prosecutor's questions were relentless, and Lucas's responses were meek, barely audible. Ethan couldn't take it anymore. The injustice was too much. Without thinking, he shot to his feet. "Stop the trial," he shouted, his voice cracking but resolute. "I have something to say." Courage in the face of doubt. The courtroom fell into stunned silence. All eyes turned to Ethan as he stood in the middle of the aisle, his messy blonde hair and small frame contrasting sharply with the seriousness of the moment. Judge Harper, a stern woman with silver-rimmed glasses, froze mid-sentence, her gavel poised in the air. "Bailiff," she barked, "remove that child immediately." But before the bailiff could move, Ethan's voice rang out again. "You can't throw me out. I know something that will change everything." The courtroom erupted into chaos. Spectators whispered furiously, craning their necks to see the boy. The defense attorney looked bewildered, while the prosecutor's mouth hung open in disbelief. The judge slammed her gavel repeatedly, demanding order. "Silence," she commanded, her voice cutting through the noise. Her sharp gaze locked on Ethan. "Young man, what could you possibly know? This is a murder trial. You shouldn't even be here." Ethan swallowed hard, his legs trembling but his resolve unshaken. "Because I know who really did it," he said, pointing at Lucas. And it wasn't him. The defendant, who had been staring at the floor moments earlier, looked up in shock. The judge's eyes narrowed. "Who are you? And what are you talking about?" Before Ethan could answer, the courtroom doors burst open. A man in a dark suit rushed in, his face pale with panic. "Ethan," he shouted, "what are you doing here?" Ethan flinched but didn't turn around. He kept his eyes fixed on the judge. "Please," he whispered, his voice trembling. "You have to listen to me." The judge hesitated, then motioned to the bailiff. "Take him to my chambers. We'll continue this privately." As the bailiff led Ethan out, he glanced back at Lucas, whose eyes held a mix of confusion and hope. Ethan prayed he wasn't too late. Truth in the shadows. In the judge's chambers, Ethan recounted what he had seen that day in the park. He described the argument, the blonde woman, and Lucas's frantic behavior. Judge Harper listened intently, her expression unreadable. When Ethan finished, she leaned back in her chair, tapping her fingers on the desk. "You're telling me you saw Lucas Hart with another woman the day Alyssa Green disappeared?" she asked. Ethan nodded. "Yes, ma'am. I didn't know who he was back then, but when I saw his face on the news, I recognized him." The judge studied him for a long moment. "This is a serious claim," she said. "Are you absolutely certain?" "I'm sure," Ethan said firmly. Judge Harper sighed. "I'll bring this to the attention of the attorneys, but understand this, Ethan. Your testimony alone isn't enough. We'll need more evidence." Ethan nodded, the weight of her words sinking in. But deep down, he knew he had done the right thing. A ripple effect. Ethan's revelation set off a chain reaction. Investigators reopened the case, scrutinizing the timeline and re-examining the evidence. Witnesses were questioned again, and new leads emerged. A surveillance camera near the park captured a grainy image of a blonde woman getting into a car, Lucas's car, on the day Alyssa disappeared. The defense team argued that this new evidence cast doubt on Lucas's guilt. The prosecutor reluctantly agreed, and the judge declared a mistrial, ordering further investigation. For Lucas, it was a glimmer of hope. For Ethan, it was proof that even the smallest voice could make a difference. A lesson in courage. Months later, Ethan sat in his room, a letter from Lucas in his hands. "Dear Ethan," it read, "thank you for standing up for me when no one else would. You reminded me that even in the darkest times, there is light. Your courage saved my life." Ethan smiled, tears welling in his eyes. He had learned that doing the right thing wasn't always easy, but it was always worth it. And sometimes, all it took to change the world was the courage to speak up. The ripple of courage. The judge's chambers loomed larger than life to Ethan, its tall bookcases filled with legal tomes casting shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly. Ethan sat perched on the edge of a leather chair, his legs too short to reach the floor, swinging nervously as Judge Harper entered. Her presence was commanding. She exuded an authority that made even adults straighten up. She removed her glasses, placing them carefully on her oak desk, and leveled a piercing gaze at Ethan. "Young man," she began, her voice measured and calm, but carrying an undeniable weight. "Do you understand the seriousness of what you've done by interrupting my courtroom?" Ethan's heart pounded like a drum. For a moment, he wondered if he had made a mistake. But then he thought of Lucas Hart, of the desperation etched on his face, and the fear melted into determination. He sat up straighter and nodded. "Yes, ma'am, but what I have to say is even more serious." The judge raised an eyebrow, leaning back in her chair. "Go on," she prompted. Ethan swallowed hard, his throat dry. "A few weeks ago," he began, his voice trembling slightly, "I was riding my bike through the park when I saw a man arguing with a woman near the lake. The man, Lucas Hart, was upset, but he wasn't yelling or anything. He seemed more scared. The woman had blonde hair, not dark like Alyssa Green. I didn't know who they were at the time, but when I saw Lucas's face on the news, I remembered. He paused, gathering his thoughts. I saw him push her into his car, but it wasn't like he was hurting her. It looked like he was trying to get her to leave quickly, like he was afraid someone would see them. Judge Harper's face remained unreadable, but her fingers tapped rhythmically on the desk. "And you told no one about this until today?" she asked. Ethan nodded, his cheeks reddening. "I told my mom, but she didn't think it was important. She said it was just a couple having a fight. But when I heard Lucas was on trial for murder, I knew I had to say something." The judge's tapping stopped. She leaned forward, her elbows resting on the desk, and fixed Ethan with a scrutinizing stare. "Ethan, if what you're saying is true, this could have serious implications for the case. But you need to understand that we can't act on your word alone. Do you understand that?" Ethan nodded again, his hands twisting nervously in his lap. "I know, but I'm telling the truth. I just want to help." For a moment, the room was silent except for the faint ticking of a clock on the wall. Judge Harper sighed and stood, her robes sweeping the floor as she moved to the window. She gazed out, her back to Ethan, deep in thought. "All right," she said finally, turning back to him. "I'm going to call both attorneys into my chambers to discuss this. You'll have to tell them exactly what you've told me. Are you ready for that?" Ethan's stomach churned, but he nodded. "Yes, Mom." When the attorneys entered the chambers, their reactions were polar opposites. The prosecutor, a tall man with sharp features and an even sharper tongue, looked annoyed. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular," he protested. "A child's testimony. What could he possibly contribute to a case of this magnitude?" The defense attorney, a woman with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, looked intrigued. "Let's hear what he has to say," she said, her voice calm but firm. "If there's even a chance he knows something relevant, we owe it to our client to listen." Ethan's hands clenched into fists at his sides as he repeated his story. His voice trembled at first, but as he spoke, a sense of resolve took over. He described the argument, the blonde woman, the car. He didn't leave out a single detail. When he finished, the prosecutor folded his arms, skepticism etched on his face. "And we're supposed to take this at face value," he scoffed. "A 10-year-old claiming to have witnessed something weeks ago." The judge raised a hand, silencing him. "Enough," she said sternly. "We're not dismissing this without due diligence. I'm ordering the police to revisit the park, check for surveillance footage, and re-examine the timeline of events. This boy's testimony deserves to be investigated." The prosecutor muttered something under his breath, but nodded begrudgingly. The defense attorney gave Ethan a small smile, as if to say, "Well done." As the meeting concluded, Judge Harper turned to Ethan. "You've done your part," she said. "Now it's up to us to follow through." The seeds of doubt. News of the boy's testimony spread quickly. By the next morning, the courthouse was surrounded by reporters, their cameras flashing and microphones poised as they shouted questions at anyone who entered. Inside, the tension was palpable. Ethan sat quietly in the back of the courtroom, his hands gripping the edges of his seat. His mom had reluctantly agreed to let him attend, though she still didn't fully understand why he had become so involved. The prosecutor stood to address the court. "Your Honor," he began, "this new development has caused quite a stir, but I maintain that the evidence against Mr. Hart is overwhelming. A single testimony from a child should not derail this case." The defense attorney rose, her voice steady and confident. "Your Honor, the child's testimony aligns with evidence we had not previously considered. Surveillance footage showing Lucas Hart with a blonde woman, not Alyssa Green, on the day in question. This demands further investigation." The judge nodded. "Agreed. This trial is adjourned pending further review." The gavel fell, and the courtroom erupted. Reporters rushed to file their stories, spectators whispered furiously, and Lucas sat frozen in his seat. For the first time in months, a glimmer of hope flickered in his eyes. A new path forward. Ethan's courage had set a chain of events into motion. Investigators uncovered more inconsistencies in the case, including witness statements that corroborated Ethan's story. The blonde woman was eventually identified, and her testimony painted a very different picture of Lucas Hart, a man trying to protect someone in danger, not a murderer. Months later, Lucas walked out of the courthouse a free man. He approached Ethan, kneeling to meet the boy's gaze. "You saved my life," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know how to thank you." Ethan smiled, his cheeks flushing. "You don't have to. I just did what was right." In that moment, Ethan learned that one act of bravery could change everything. He wasn't just a kid anymore. He was someone who had made a difference, proving that even the smallest voices could ripple through the world and create waves of justice. The web of truth. The days following Ethan's testimony felt like a whirlwind. For the first time since the trial began, there was a crack in the seemingly unbreakable case against Lucas Hart. But cracks weren't enough. They needed to break the entire foundation. Ethan was back at school, sitting in his history class, when his name was called over the loudspeaker. "Ethan Miller, please report to the principal's office." His classmates murmured curiously as Ethan stood, his cheeks turning red. He grabbed his backpack and trudged toward the office, dreading what might await him. Did he do something wrong by speaking up? Did someone think he was lying? But when he opened the door to the principal's office, he didn't find the principal. Instead, Judge Harper and the defense attorney stood waiting. His mom was there too, her expression a mix of worry and pride. "Ethan," Judge Harper began, her tone softer than he remembered from the courtroom, "we need your help." The defense team had uncovered surveillance footage from the park, just as Judge Harper had ordered. Though the grainy video didn't capture faces, it confirmed part of Ethan's account. A man and a blonde woman had been near the lake the day Alyssa disappeared. But it wasn't enough. The prosecution was pushing back, calling Ethan's testimony unreliable, and claiming the footage proved nothing. They needed more to sway the jury and the public. That's where Ethan came in. "We're asking a lot of you," the defense attorney said, kneeling so her eyes were level with Ethan's. "We need you to testify again, this time in front of the jury. You'll have to tell them everything you told the judge. It's going to be hard, and people might try to make you doubt yourself. But if you can do it, you could make all the difference." Ethan's stomach churned. The thought of standing in front of so many people, with cameras and microphones pointed at him, was terrifying. But then he thought of Lucas, the man who had looked so defeated yet hopeful when Ethan had spoken up. And he thought of Alyssa Green, whose true story might never be known unless someone found the courage to uncover it. "I'll do it," Ethan said, his voice steady despite the knot in his stomach. His mom squeezed his shoulder, her pride evident even as her worry lingered. A moment of truth. The courtroom was packed the day Ethan took the stand. Spectators filled every seat, and reporters lined the walls, their cameras trained on the boy who had become the unlikely centerpiece of a murder trial. Ethan sat in the witness chair, his feet barely touching the floor. Judge Harper watched him with a reassuring nod, while the defense attorney stood nearby, ready to guide him through his testimony. Across the room, the prosecutor sat with his arms crossed, his eyes narrowing as he sized up the young witness. "Ethan," the defense attorney began, her voice gentle, "can you tell the court what you saw on the day Alyssa Green disappeared?" Ethan took a deep breath and began to speak. He told the story just as he had before, his voice clear and unwavering despite the weight of the moment. He described the argument by the lake, the blonde woman, and the man who had shoved her into the car. He explained how he hadn't realized who Lucas Hart was until he saw the news, and how he had wrestled with the decision to speak up. When he finished, the courtroom was silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air. The prosecutor rose, his expression sharp. "Ethan," he said, his voice clipped, "you've told a very detailed story. But isn't it possible you're mistaken? It was weeks ago, after all, and you're only 10 years old. Memory isn't perfect, especially for someone your age." Ethan felt his cheeks flush, but he didn't waver. "I know what I saw," he said firmly. "I'm not lying." The prosecutor's eyes narrowed. "Perhaps you're not lying intentionally, but you could be confused. You say the woman had blonde hair, but Alyssa Green didn't. Are you sure you didn't mix things up?" Ethan sat up straighter, his blue eyes flashing with determination. "I'm sure. The woman I saw wasn't Alyssa Green." The prosecutor opened his mouth to press further, but Judge Harper raised a hand. "That's enough, counselor," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Let the boy finish." Ethan glanced at the judge, grateful for her support. He turned back to the prosecutor, his voice strong despite his nerves. "I know it's hard to believe me," he said, addressing the whole room. "But I'm telling the truth. If you don't believe me, look harder. Find out who the blonde woman is. She might know what really happened." The turning point. Ethan's testimony sent shockwaves through the courtroom and beyond. Public opinion, once firmly against Lucas, began to shift. People started to wonder, could the case against him be as airtight as they had thought? The defense team redoubled their efforts, using Ethan's testimony as a launching point to uncover new evidence. They found another witness, a jogger who had seen a man and a blonde woman arguing in the park that day but hadn't come forward, thinking it wasn't important. Their account matched Ethan's. Meanwhile, investigators re-examined Lucas's alibi and discovered a detail they had overlooked: a receipt from a gas station miles away from where Alyssa's body was found, time-stamped shortly after the argument Ethan described. It wasn't a complete exoneration, but it cast further doubt on the timeline presented by the prosecution. The blonde woman, however, remained a mystery. Despite their best efforts, investigators couldn't track her down. It was as if she had vanished. The unseen savior. One evening, weeks after Ethan's testimony, a woman walked into the police station. She had long blonde hair and a nervous demeanor, her hands twisting together as she approached the front desk. "My name is Rachel Harris," she said, her voice shaking. "I think I might have information about the Alyssa Green case." Rachel's story, once verified, became the final piece of the puzzle. She had been in an abusive relationship with a man connected to Alyssa's social circle. The day Ethan saw her and Lucas in the park, Lucas had been helping her escape. He had been desperate to get her away from her abuser and had taken her to a safe location. The timeline proved that Lucas couldn't have been involved in Alyssa's murder. Rachel's testimony, combined with Ethan's and the other new evidence, was enough to clear Lucas's name. The prosecution dropped the charges, and Lucas walked out of the courthouse a free man. The power of one voice. When it was all over, Lucas visited Ethan's home. He knelt down and looked the boy in the eyes, his own filled with gratitude. "Thank you," Lucas said, his voice thick with emotion. "You didn't just save me. You reminded me that there's still good in this world. You gave me my life back." Ethan smiled, his cheeks flushing. "I just told the truth," he said simply. But it wasn't just the truth, it was courage. Ethan's bravery had unraveled a web of lies, saved an innocent man, and brought justice closer to the light. It was a lesson to everyone who heard the story. No matter how small your voice may seem, it has the power to change the world. A ripple becomes a wave. The courtroom was quiet now, its echoes of arguments and outbursts replaced by the soft murmurs of reporters drafting their stories. Ethan and his mother sat in the gallery, watching as Lucas' heart stood to leave. He looked different. His once hollow eyes now carried a faint spark. His posture no longer slumped in defeat. For the first time in months, Lucas was free. Ethan watched as Lucas turned to shake his lawyer's hand, gratitude etched in every movement. But instead of heading for the exit, Lucas approached Ethan. Kneeling to the boy's level, he spoke with a voice that carried both relief and reverence. "Ethan," Lucas began, his voice steady but thick with emotion, "I don't think I'll ever find the words to thank you. You didn't have to do what you did. You could have stayed quiet, but you didn't. You saved me." Ethan felt his cheeks flush. "I just told the truth," he said softly. You didn't deserve what was happening to you." Lucas smiled, but there was a weight behind it. "Telling the truth isn't always easy," he said, "especially when no one wants to hear it. You're braver than most adults I know." The aftermath. The case didn't end with Lucas's release. The revelation of Rachel Harris, the blonde woman from the park, had turned the investigation on its head. With her testimony, the police were able to piece together new leads, uncovering a dark web of secrets that had been buried beneath the surface of Alyssa Green's life. Rachel's abusive ex-boyfriend, a man named Greg Turner, became the prime suspect. He had a history of violence and was known to have been jealous of Alyssa's success and independence. The timeline, bolstered by Rachel's account and Ethan's testimony, placed Greg near the scene of Alyssa's disappearance. Though it took months, Greg was eventually arrested and charged with Alyssa's murder. Justice for Alyssa was slow, but it was moving in the right direction. A direction that started with the courage of a 10-year-old boy who refused to stay silent. A growing voice. Ethan returned to school after the trial, expecting life to go back to normal. But things were far from ordinary. His classmates treated him like a hero, whispering about him in the hallways and asking endless questions during lunch. Teachers smiled at him with a mixture of pride and amazement, and even the principal called him into the office to thank him for his bravery. At first, the attention was overwhelming. Ethan wasn't used to being in the spotlight, and he felt awkward being praised for something he believed anyone would do. But as the days passed, he realized the story wasn't just about him. It was about what his actions represented, the power of standing up for what's right, no matter how small or scared you feel. One afternoon, Ethan's mom came into his room holding a stack of envelopes. "These are for you," she said, placing them on his desk. Ethan opened the first one carefully. It was a letter from a man in another state who had read about the trial. "Dear Ethan," it began, "I just wanted to say how inspired I was by your courage. You reminded me that even the smallest actions can make a big difference. Thank you for giving me hope." Every letter he opened was like that. Messages of gratitude, admiration, and encouragement. They came from people of all ages and walks of life, each one moved by his story. Some shared their own struggles with speaking up. Others simply wanted to say thank you. Ethan's mom watched as he read through the letters, her eyes misty. "You've touched more lives than you'll ever know," she said softly. "A platform for change." The media attention surrounding the trial eventually faded, but Ethan's story continued to resonate. A local community group invited him to speak at their event about standing up for justice. Though nervous at first, Ethan accepted. The auditorium was filled with people, from curious children to older adults, all eager to hear from the boy who had taken a stand. Ethan stood at the podium, his heart pounding in his chest, but as he looked out at the audience, he felt a wave of calm. "I'm not a hero," he began, his voice steady despite the microphone amplifying his every word. "I'm just a kid who noticed something and decided to say something. And I think that's something we can all do. Sometimes, being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It just means you don't let the fear stop you." The room erupted into applause, and Ethan smiled. In that moment, he realized the power of his story wasn't just in what he had done. It was in how it inspired others to find their own courage. The legacy of truth. Years later, Ethan would look back on the trial as the turning point in his life. What had started as a simple observation in a park had transformed into a lesson about integrity, justice, and the impact of a single voice. Lucas Hart went on to rebuild his life, becoming an advocate for those wrongfully accused. He and Ethan stayed in touch, their bond forged through the shared experience of seeking truth in the face of overwhelming odds. Rachel Harris, once living in fear, found solace in knowing her story had helped bring justice for Alyssa. She became an advocate for survivors of abuse, using her voice to protect others the way Ethan's voice had protected Lucas. And Ethan. He grew up carrying the lessons of the trial with him. Whether he was standing up for a friend, volunteering in his community, or simply offering a kind word to someone in need, he lived by the principle that one voice, no matter how small, could ripple outward and create waves of change. It was a legacy born not of grandeur, but of quiet courage, a reminder to everyone that the truth, when spoken with conviction, has the power to reshape lives and uncover justice, even in the darkest of places. The weight of change. As the dust settled after the trial, life in Ethan's small Ohio town seemed to return to its usual rhythm. The streets were once again quiet, the courthouse no longer a hub of reporters and curious onlookers. Yet for Ethan, life was anything but ordinary. He carried the weight of the trial with him, not as a burden, but as a profound reminder of the power of his actions. Ethan's newfound attention brought with it opportunities he never imagined. His teachers encouraged him to write about his experience, and one of his essays was published in the local newspaper. Titled, "The Power of Speaking Up," it quickly garnered attention, leading to an invitation to speak at a statewide youth leadership conference. The idea of speaking to hundreds of people made Ethan's stomach twist in knots, but his mom's gentle encouragement and his memories of Lucas's gratitude spurred him on. The speech that moved a room. The auditorium was larger than anything Ethan had ever seen. Rows of seats stretched out before him, filled with students, educators, and community leaders. As he stepped onto the stage, the spotlight felt warm against his skin, and the microphone trembled slightly in his hand. Taking a deep breath, he began. "Good afternoon," he said, his voice steady despite the butterflies in his stomach. "My name is Ethan Miller, and a few months ago, I was just a kid riding my bike in the park, thinking about pizza and video games. I never thought I'd be standing here today, sharing my story with all of you." The audience chuckled softly, their attention fixed on him. "But sometimes life surprises you," Ethan continued. "Sometimes you're faced with something that feels too big, too scary, and you have to decide if you're going to stand up or stay quiet. For me, that moment came when I realized an innocent man's life was at stake. I was scared. I didn't know if anyone would believe me, but I knew I couldn't live with myself if I stayed silent." Ethan paused, scanning the room. He could see the impact of his words in the attentive faces staring back at him. "I learned that bravery isn't about being fearless," he said, his voice growing stronger. "It's about doing what's right, even when you're scared. And I think we all have that bravery inside us. It might not look the same for everyone, but it's there." The crowd erupted into applause as Ethan stepped back from the microphone. He felt a swell of pride, not for himself, but for the message he had shared. He hoped it would inspire others to find their own courage when the moment called for it. A new chapter. The conference marked the beginning of a new chapter in Ethan's life. His story caught the attention of a nonprofit organization that worked to help people who had been wrongfully accused. They invited Ethan to join a panel discussion with Lucas Hart and Rachel Harris. Sitting on the stage with Lucas and Rachel felt surreal. Lucas spoke first, sharing his harrowing experience of being accused of a crime he didn't commit. His voice cracked as he described the loneliness and despair he had felt, but he ended his story with a smile directed at Ethan. "This boy saved my life," Lucas said, his voice filled with gratitude. "He didn't just notice something and walk away. He acted. That's a lesson we can all learn from, no matter how old we are." Rachel spoke next, her voice steady but emotional. She shared her journey of escaping abuse and finding the strength to come forward with the truth. "Ethan's courage gave me the push I needed," she said. "He reminded me that speaking up can change everything, even when it feels impossible." When it was Ethan's turn to speak, he felt a wave of confidence wash over him. "I didn't know how big this would all become," he admitted. "I just knew I couldn't stay silent. But now I see how one small action can ripple out and make a difference. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that everyone has a role to play in making the world better, no matter how small you think your part might be." The ripple expands. Ethan's story continued to spread, reaching people far beyond his small town. Letters poured in from across the country, many from kids who had faced their own struggles with standing up for what they believed in. Some wrote about stopping bullying in their schools. Others shared stories of speaking out against injustices in their communities. Ethan replied to as many letters as he could, each one fueling his desire to make a lasting impact. He started volunteering with local youth groups, sharing his story, and encouraging other kids to find their voices. His small actions began to inspire larger ones, creating a wave of change that reached far and wide. The world listens. Years later, Ethan was invited to speak at a national conference on justice reform. Now a young adult, his voice carried the same clarity and conviction it had in the courtroom that day. The audience included judges, lawyers, activists, and even lawmakers, all eager to hear from the boy who had once stopped a trial to tell the truth. Ethan stood at the podium, his heart full as he gazed at the crowd. "The lesson I've learned," he said, "is that justice isn't something that just happens. It's something we have to fight for, something we have to nurture. And sometimes it starts with one small voice, a voice that refuses to stay silent." The legacy of courage. Ethan's actions had created a legacy that would outlive the trial, the speeches, and even the letters. He had shown the world that courage wasn't about age or status. It was about heart. Through his journey, he reminded everyone that even the smallest ripples could grow into waves capable of reshaping lives and uncovering truths long hidden. And in the end, that was the real gift. A world that listened, learned, and grew a little braver, all because one boy decided to speak up. A quiet revolution. Years passed, and the story of Ethan Miller, the boy who interrupted a murder trial to reveal a hidden truth, became the stuff of local legend. For most, the event was a singular moment in history, a courtroom drama that ended with justice served. But for Ethan, it was only the beginning of a life shaped by an unwavering commitment to integrity and courage. The unexpected letter. It was a crisp autumn morning when Ethan, now in his late teens, received an envelope in the mail. The sender's name was unfamiliar, Josephine Carter. Inside, a handwritten note revealed a heartfelt message. "Dear Ethan, I don't know if you remember me, but I was sitting in the courtroom the day you stood up and spoke the truth. At the time, I was there for my brother's hearing. He had been accused of something he didn't do. Watching you find the courage to speak out inspired me to do the same. My testimony wasn't easy, but it led to the evidence that cleared his name. I wanted to thank you for being brave enough to act, because your courage gave me the strength I needed. You don't know how many lives you've touched, but I'm one of them. With gratitude, Josephine Carter *. Ethan reread the letter several times, each word sinking deeper into his heart. He had never met Josephine, but her story reinforced something he had learned during his journey. Bravery had a ripple effect. The courage of one person could inspire countless others, sparking change in ways that might never be fully known. The advocate's path. Encouraged by stories like Josephine's, Ethan decided to pursue a career in law. The courtroom, once an intimidating place of authority, had become a symbol of justice for him, a place where truth could be defended and lives could be saved. Enrolling in a pre-law program at a nearby university, Ethan immersed himself in his studies. He devoured case files, pored over legal texts, and volunteered at a nonprofit organization that provided legal aid to underserved communities. It was exhausting work, but Ethan found it fulfilling. Every case he worked on, no matter how small, felt like a step toward ensuring the scales of justice were balanced. Ethan's professors were struck by his tenacity and clarity of purpose. One day, after class, his mentor, Professor Lawrence, stopped him. "Ethan," he said, "you remind me of why I entered this field in the first place. Justice isn't just about laws. It's about people. Never lose that perspective." "I won't," Ethan replied, his voice resolute. "Justice is about giving people hope, just like someone gave me." An unlikely reunion. In his final year of university, Ethan attended a seminar on wrongful convictions. Among the panelists was Lucas Hart. It had been years since Ethan had last seen Lucas, but the man looked healthier, more confident, and alive in a way Ethan could barely recognize. Lucas's presentation focused on his work with advocacy groups that fought for people who had been wrongfully accused. He shared harrowing stories of individuals who had lost years of their lives to injustices, but he also spoke about hope, how even the smallest actions could lead to monumental change. After the seminar, Ethan approached Lucas. The recognition was immediate. Lucas's face broke into a wide smile, and he pulled Ethan into a hug. "Look at you," Lucas said, his voice thick with emotion. "The boy who saved my life, all grown up." "And look at you," Ethan replied with a grin. "The man who turned his life into a force for good." They spent hours catching up, sharing stories of their respective journeys. Lucas told Ethan about the challenges of his advocacy work, the resistance, the heartache, but also the triumphs. Ethan shared his dreams of becoming a lawyer, inspired by Lucas's case and the lessons he had learned in that courtroom so many years ago. "You're going to change the world," Lucas said, his voice brimming with conviction. "You already have." Building bridges. Ethan's first case as a practicing attorney came sooner than he expected. A young man named Javier Alvarez had been accused of theft, but the evidence against him was flimsy at best. Javier's family couldn't afford a lawyer, so Ethan, now working for the same nonprofit where he had volunteered, took the case pro bono. Ethan quickly discovered that Javier's story mirrored many he had heard before. A young man from a disadvantaged background caught in a system that assumed his guilt before examining the facts. But Ethan was determined to fight for him, just as he had fought for Lucas. In court, Ethan was a force to be reckoned with. He meticulously picked apart the prosecution's case, pointing out inconsistencies and highlighting the lack of credible evidence. But it wasn't just his legal acumen that stood out. It was his empathy. He spoke about Javier, not as a statistic or a case number, but as a human being whose future was at stake. When the verdict of not guilty was announced, Javier broke down in tears. His family rushed to embrace him, their gratitude pouring out in waves. Ethan stood back, his heart swelling with pride. This wasn't just about winning a case, it was about giving someone their life back. A movement takes shape. As Ethan's career progressed, he began to notice a recurring theme. The system often failed those who needed it most. Determined to create lasting change, he launched an initiative called Voices for Justice, aimed at empowering communities to stand up against injustices. The program focused on education, advocacy, and providing resources to those who felt voiceless. Through Voices for Justice, Ethan worked with schools, community centers, and even prisons, sharing his story and encouraging others to find their own courage. His message was simple but powerful. Your voice matters. Your actions matter. Together, we can make a difference. The initiative gained national attention, attracting volunteers, donors, and media coverage. But for Ethan, the true success lay in the stories of those it helped. Stories of people who, like him, had found the courage to speak up and change the course of their lives. A legacy of courage. Decades later, Ethan stood on the steps of the courthouse where it had all begun. Now a seasoned attorney and activist, he gazed at the building with a mixture of nostalgia and reverence. Beside him stood a group of young volunteers from Voices for Justice, eager to begin their journey of making the world a better place. Ethan smiled as he addressed them. "I was about your age when I first learned that one voice can make a difference," he said. "It doesn't matter how small you think you are or how scared you feel. What matters is that you act. Because every ripple we create has the potential to become a wave." As the volunteers dispersed to begin their work, Ethan lingered for a moment, looking up at the courthouse steps. The memory of that day, his voice ringing out in the middle of a tense courtroom, the fear and determination that had gripped him, was as vivid as ever. He realized then that courage wasn't a fleeting moment. It was a way of life. And as long as he had the strength to speak, to act, and to inspire, he knew he would never stop fighting for justice. Because sometimes one voice was all it took to change the world. A life well spoken. Ethan Miller's journey was never about fame or recognition. It wasn't about being a hero or a savior. From the moment he stood in that courtroom as a 10-year-old boy, his actions were guided by something far simpler and more profound. The belief that doing what is right, no matter how daunting, is worth the risk. A reunion of gratitude. Years later, at a celebratory event marking the 25th anniversary of Voices for Justice, Ethan found himself surrounded by familiar faces, people whose lives had intersected with his in meaningful ways. Lucas Hart was there, standing tall and confident as he spoke to a small group about the importance of second chances. Rachel Harris, now an advocate for domestic abuse survivors, mingled with volunteers, her smile radiant as she shared stories of the lives she had helped transform. Ethan's mother, Jessica, now graying but no less vibrant, stood at his side. She watched her son with pride, marveling at the legacy he had built from a single act of courage. During the evening's program, a young woman named Maya took the stage. A recent recipient of the Voices for Justice Scholarship, she spoke about how the organization had changed her life. "I grew up thinking my voice didn't matter," Maya said, her voice trembling with emotion. "But then I heard Ethan's story, and it taught me that even the smallest voices can create the biggest changes. Today, I'm studying to become a public defender because I want to be the voice for people who feel voiceless, just like Ethan was for Lucas Hart." Ethan blinked back tears as the room erupted in applause. Maya's words reaffirmed what he had always believed. Courage and truth have a way of spreading, lighting fires in hearts that might otherwise have remained cold. A quiet reflection. That night, as the celebration wound down and the guests began to leave, Ethan found himself alone on the balcony, gazing at the city lights below. The night air was cool, and the sounds of distant laughter drifted up from the streets. His mind wandered back to that summer afternoon in the park, the moment that had set his life on this extraordinary path. He thought of the fear he had felt standing in that courtroom, the doubts that had plagued him, and the relief when the truth finally came to light. He realized something he hadn't fully grasped before. Courage isn't just a single moment or act. It's a choice you make every day, in big ways and small. It's in the decision to speak up when others remain silent, to lend a hand when it's easier to walk away, to fight for justice even when it feels like an uphill battle. The final lesson. Ethan's life had become a testament to the power of that choice. His actions had shown that bravery isn't reserved for the fearless. It belongs to anyone willing to step forward in the face of uncertainty. He had taught others that their voices mattered, that their actions had meaning, and that together they could create a world where truth and justice prevailed. As he stood on the balcony, Ethan whispered the words that had guided him all these years. It only takes one voice to start a ripple. And with that, he turned back toward the celebration, ready to continue the work that had become his life's purpose. Because while one voice can start a ripple, it's the collective voices of many that create the wave. And Ethan Miller knew that as long as people were willing to speak up, the world would always have hope. The lesson was clear. Speak up, act with courage, and never underestimate the power of truth. It might just change everything. This concludes the story. Thank you for watching until the end. I hope you found it enjoyable. If you did, please consider liking the video and sharing it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and activate the notification bell for more captivating stories. Have a great day.